Can you imagine standing in the snow with your face burning from cold and shame while your own father throws your Christmas gifts into the yard? I can. I can still hear the thud of each box hitting the ground, the laughter behind me, and my brother starting that slow clap like it was some kind of performance. In that moment, I realized the people who were supposed to protect me had become experts at breaking me. My name is Alara Vance, and this is how the worst Christmas Eve of my life became the moment I finally stopped being their silent support system and started being my own. For 8 years, I sent $4,200 home every month. It wasn't something I bragged about or reminded them of. It was simply my way of helping, of keeping the family together. I covered my mother's treatments, my father's endless business failures, and Jackson's life of excuses masked as big plans. Every transfer is sitting in a folder on my computer. 96 payments, over $386,000. But in my family, I was never the giver. Somehow, the credit always floated to Jackson. My father toasted him at every meal, calling him the backbone of the family. And Jackson soaked it in, even though he didn't earn a single ounce of the praise. I let it go for years, thinking maybe one day they would see me. Maybe one day they'd say thank you. But the truth is, in that house, my contributions were treated like imaginary tales. Stories that were easy to ignore because they didn't fit their favorite narrative. My father liked to believe his son was a rising star. My mother liked to pretend everything was balanced and peaceful. And Jackson liked living in the center of attention without doing any of the work. I kept my records, not because I wanted revenge, but because it was the only way to remind myself that I wasn't imagining everything. I existed. I mattered. I wasn't the useless person they tried to paint me as. Still, every time I walked through that front door, the same cold feeling crept over me. They smiled at me, but it was the smile you give someone when you're waiting for them to hand something over. My father would pat my shoulder and say, "You're doing fine, kiddo," then turn around and praise Jackson for things he hadn't even done. My mother would talk about how proud she was of him and how much he helped them. I'd stand there silently, knowing full well the only help came from me. For years, I stayed quiet. For years, I tried to earn their love through my paycheck. But that Christmas Eve, with the snow stinging my cheeks and my father screaming at me, something shifted. The weight I had carried for so long finally snapped. And the secret I had kept, my one silent protection, was finally ready to step into the light. Thanksgiving should have felt warm and peaceful. But that year it only showed me how deep the cracks in my family had grown. Everyone gathered around the table, and conversations flowed easily, at least for them. Jackson took control of the room like he always did. He spoke loudly, waving his hands as he described a new app he claimed would make him a billionaire. He talked about investors, meetings, and big plans that seemed to appear only when he needed attention. The family listened with wide eyes, nodding along as if he had already built an empire. My father looked at him the way proud parents look at children who have truly achieved something. He leaned back in his chair, smiling like he had won a prize. Every few minutes he repeated, "That's my son," as if saying it made it real. People clapped him on the back, offering congratulations for achievements that didn't exist. It was a show, and everyone fell for it. At one point, my aunt turned to me and asked how my work was going. Before I could answer, my father cut in. He laughed lightly and said, "Alara designs bridges or something. It's safe work. Nothing too big." He said it like my career was a small hobby, not the reason I barely slept for months. He didn't mention that I had just earned a major promotion. He didn't say that I had helped lead a massive engineering project. It was easier for him to pretend that nothing I did mattered. I felt the sting of his words, but I didn't argue. I had learned long ago that defending myself only made things worse. So I stayed quiet while the table returned to praising Jackson's dreams. Inside, though, I felt something shift. It was the first time I realized how comfortable they were pretending I had no value. Later that evening, when everyone was leaving, my mother took my hand. She smiled softly and said she was grateful that Jackson was doing so well and that he took such great care of them. Her voice was gentle, but her words cut deeper than she knew. I stood there listening, knowing her belief came from the stories Jackson told, not from anything real. That moment stayed with me long after Thanksgiving ended. I drove home feeling drained. I had spent years working hard, building a career I was proud of, and helping my family whenever they needed me. Yet they treated my work like it was insignificant. They talked about Jackson as if he was their lifeline, even though his plans changed every month and never led anywhere. Thanksgiving showed me that their view of me wasn't going to change no matter how hard I tried. They wanted Jackson to be the hero, and they preferred a version of me that stayed in the background. I didn't argue or correct them, but inside, something important settled into place. I realized their blindness wasn't my burden anymore. It wasn't my job to prove myself to people who refused to see me. On December 22nd, I was finishing a long day at work when my phone rang. Jackson's name flashed across the screen, and something in my stomach tightened. He rarely called unless he needed something. When I answered, his voice sounded forced, like he was trying too hard to sound worried. He told me Dad was facing a serious problem and made it seem like everything was falling apart. Before I could even ask questions, he rushed into an explanation about a debt that had spiraled out of control. He said the amount was huge, far more than anything he had admitted before. His tone shifted from concern to pressure within seconds. He talked fast, throwing out numbers and excuses, trying to make it sound like this crisis came out of nowhere. It didn't take long to realize the real issue wasn't about Dad at all. It was about another one of Jackson's failed ideas. A project he had bragged about for months had crashed, leaving a mountain of debt behind. That was the emergency he suddenly cared about. He then jumped to the solution he had already decided on. They wanted me to help by co-signing a new loan. He tried to make it sound simple, like it was only a signature and nothing more. He mentioned the house on Cedar Lane as if it were still in my parents' name, insisting it was the only property that could secure the amount they needed. He kept repeating that everything would be temporary and that I shouldn't worry about anything. A few minutes after we hung up, an email appeared in my inbox. It held a loan application filled out with my name typed neatly beside cosigner. The property listed as collateral was 112 Cedar Lane. Seeing the address made me sit up straight. My parents hadn't owned that house in years, and Jackson knew that. They all knew that, yet they were pretending it still belonged to them, hoping I would agree without looking deeper. I walked to my safe and took out the documents I kept there. The deed lay exactly where I had placed it. The owner listed on it wasn't my father, and it wasn't my mother either. The name on the deed was Aegis Holdings, LLC. Under that, in smaller print, it named the sole member, me. I had purchased the house quietly after it was nearly lost, making sure my parents could continue living there without worry. They never bothered to ask how the house had been saved. They believed what they wanted to believe, and I never corrected them. Holding the deed that night, I felt a mix of disappointment and clarity. They weren't coming to me because they trusted me. They weren't asking for help out of respect or honesty. They were hoping I would agree blindly, just like I had for years. Seeing their plan laid out so boldly made one thing clear. This wasn't a plea for support. It was a move made out of desperation, dressed up as concern. And this time, I wasn't going to play along. After Jackson's call, things escalated faster than I expected. By the next morning, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. It felt like everyone who had my number suddenly remembered I existed, but only to pressure me. First came my mother, her voice shaky as she begged me to understand their situation. She kept repeating that Jackson was doing his best, and that refusing to help would ruin everything. She sounded more desperate than concerned, as if she had already been convinced that I was the reason things were falling apart. Then messages from relatives began appearing one after another. Some were from people I hadn't heard from in years. They wrote as if they knew the full story, telling me that I was being cold and unfair. They urged me to think about the family, saying that I was letting them down by not stepping in. None of them asked for my side or what I was dealing with. They simply accepted whatever Jackson had told them. It became clear that he had been busy turning the situation into a one-sided story where I played the heartless one. According to him, I had the power to fix everything but refused out of spite. He knew exactly how to twist things to get sympathy and attention. By the time the messages reached me, most people had already chosen a side, and it wasn't mine. The pressure only grew as the hours passed. It didn't matter that none of them understood the full truth. It didn't matter that the house wasn't theirs to offer as collateral. They wanted someone to blame, and I was the easiest choice. Their belief in Jackson's version of events spread quickly, and soon I was painted as the person who abandoned the family in their lowest moment. On Christmas Eve morning, everything reached a peak. My father called, and his tone was sharp from the moment I answered. He didn't ask how I was doing or if I needed time to think. He went straight to what he wanted. He told me to come to the dinner that evening and act like part of the family. Then he added that once I got there, I was expected to sign the loan papers. If I refused, he said not to come at all. It wasn't an invitation, it was a demand. For a moment, I just sat there holding the phone, listening to the silence after he hung up. His words didn't surprise me, but they still stung. They were willing to push me aside completely if I didn't fall in line. That was the moment something became crystal clear. I would go to dinner, but not for the reason they wanted. I wasn't going to sign anything, and I wasn't going to let them corner me again. I was going to see their behavior firsthand and gather the last proof I needed. They thought they were forcing me into a corner, but they didn't realize I had already stopped playing their game. When I pulled up to the house on Christmas Eve, the windows glowed with bright lights, but the warmth didn't match what waited inside. The moment I stepped through the door, I could feel every pair of eyes on me. The room was full, packed with relatives who acted like they had all gathered for a joyful celebration, but their expressions told another story. They were expecting drama, and they were ready to judge me before I even opened my mouth. I carried a few wrapped gifts with me, hoping to keep things calm, or at least polite. As soon as my mother saw them, she smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes and said, "How sweet of Jackson to handle the presents." She didn't even pause to consider that I might have brought them myself. It was as if she couldn't imagine me doing something thoughtful without my brother being involved. I let the comment pass. I wasn't here to argue over small things. I barely had time to take off my coat before my father marched toward me with a stack of papers in his hand. He didn't bother with greetings. He set the documents on the dining table with a loud smack, making everyone turn toward us. "Sign this," he said, not even trying to lower his voice. "We're not waiting anymore." The room went quiet. You could hear someone's fork drop on a plate. I picked up the papers and glanced over them, recognizing the loan information immediately. I kept my voice steady and said, "I can't sign this because the house listed here isn't in my name or yours." My father's face tightened instantly. His jaw clenched, and the color rose in his cheeks. "What are you talking about?" he snapped. "That house is mine. Don't play games." Before I could respond, Jackson stepped forward with that same smug look he always wore when he thought he had the upper hand. "Just stop making excuses," he muttered. "You're here to help, so do it. At least be useful tonight." The words hung in the air, sharp and heavy. Instead of reacting, I slowly pulled out my phone and tapped the record button without anyone noticing. I lifted my head and spoke clearly, making sure every word would be captured. "Just to confirm," I said, "you want me to sign a loan for $600,000, using a property that isn't legally yours, and you're calling me ungrateful for saying no. Is that correct?" My father slammed his hand on the table. "Yes," he shouted. "You owe us. After everything this family has done for you." Several relatives nodded along as if they had rehearsed their reactions. No one questioned him. No one wondered why he was acting as if he owned something he didn't. They simply joined the pressure, adding weight to a situation they didn't understand. Standing there, with all their anger pointed at me, I didn't feel shaken anymore. Their loud voices, sharp accusations, and blaming eyes only confirmed what I already knew. This wasn't a holiday gathering. It was an ambush dressed as Christmas dinner. And now I finally had what I came for. Their true intentions, spoken openly, caught on record. The moment I refused to sign those papers, everything inside that house shifted. It was like someone had pulled away the last curtain, and every hidden frustration came spilling out at once. No one held back. Relatives who barely spoke to me suddenly had opinions about my entire life. Words shot across the room like sharp stones, each one meant to cut a little deeper. Jackson didn't waste a second. He stepped forward with that usual smirk and said I had always been jealous of him, as if that explained everything. Others joined in, repeating whatever insult came to mind. They didn't care if it was true, they cared about piling on. I stayed still, letting my phone record every moment. Their anger wasn't new, but hearing it all at once was like standing in the middle of a storm I had seen brewing for years. My father, who had been pacing like he was about to explode, finally snapped. His rage turned physical. He marched to the Christmas tree, grabbed the gifts I brought, and dragged them toward the door. The wrapping paper tore as he pulled them across the floor. He threw the first one outside with so much force it burst open in the snow. Then he tossed the second, then the third, each one landing with a soft thud in the cold night. Everyone watched him, but no one tried to stop him. He didn't care about the gifts, he cared about sending a message. He pointed at the door and shouted so loudly the windows rattled, "Get out of my house!" For a second, the entire room went silent. Then, as if on cue, Jackson started clapping slowly, dragging his palms together in a way that made every beat feel mocking. Others joined him, uncles, cousins, even people who barely knew me. It wasn't applause. It was a warning. They were showing me exactly where I stood in that family. I glanced toward my mother, hoping she would say something, anything. But she just stared at the floor, her hands shaking slightly. She didn't defend me. She didn't speak up. She didn't even look in my direction. It was clear she had chosen her silence long before tonight. I stepped toward the door, walking past faces that looked at me like I was the cause of every problem they'd ever had. Their voices blended into a low hum as I reached the entryway, their anger fading behind me like a distant crowd. When I finally turned back to my father, he was standing rigid, breathing hard, his hands still raised toward the open door. I met his stare without blinking. There was no fear left in me, only clarity. "Gladly," I said, my voice steady and cold. "But just remember, you haven't seen the last of me." He didn't understand what I meant, not yet. But soon he would. I picked up my keys, stepped out into the freezing air, and let the door close behind me, knowing that everything they had done tonight would come back to them far sooner than they expected. I sat in my car for a long moment, watching the snow pile up on the boxes my father had thrown outside. Instead of crying or shaking, I felt this strange, steady quiet settle over me. Everything they had said replayed in my mind, but it no longer hit the way it used to. It was like the part of me that still wanted their approval had finally died right there on the driveway. I took a slow breath and called Ms. Thorne. My voice didn't shake. I told her I had the video and that I was ready to move forward. She didn't sound surprised. She just said she'd prepare everything and that I had done the right thing by documenting it. When I hung up, I felt lighter, like a decision I'd been avoiding all my life had been made for me. Then I called 911. I gave the address clearly and explained that I was the owner and that the people inside were refusing to leave. The operator asked a few questions and I answered calmly. I didn't feel scared or guilty. I felt like someone finally standing up for themselves after years of letting others walk all over them. After the call, I didn't drive home. I knew what I would find there, and I didn't want to show up angry or emotional. Instead, I pulled into an empty parking lot near an old grocery store. Snow covered the windshields of the few cars still there, and everything looked soft and silent. I leaned back and opened the security app on my phone. The camera gave me a full view of the living room. They weren't upset. They weren't worried. They weren't even talking about what had happened. They were celebrating. Jackson was laughing loudly, waving around one of the wine bottles I had brought as if it was some trophy he had earned. My father sat in his usual chair, drinking like nothing had happened. A few relatives were passing around snacks, acting as if throwing me out had been the highlight of the night. Seeing it from the outside like that made something in me settle completely. This was who they were. This was how little I meant to them. They didn't love me. They loved control. They loved having someone to blame when their lives didn't go the way they wanted. And now that I wasn't standing there to absorb their anger, they were free to enjoy their little victory. I watched them for a while. Not because I was hurt, but because it confirmed everything I needed to know. I wasn't losing a family. I was walking away from people who had never treated me like part of theirs. As the snow kept falling around me, I felt the calm deepen. Tonight had been the end of something, but it was also the beginning of my freedom. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back to the life they tried to trap me in. I was done. When the police reached the house, I kept watching through the camera. The door opened, and my father stepped out with that same confident smile he always used when he thought he could talk his way out of anything. I could almost hear his tone as he greeted the officers like they were there to support him. He pointed inside as if explaining some simple family issue. He acted like the whole situation was just me being dramatic. But the lead officer didn't play along. He didn't smile or nod. He stopped my father mid-sentence and spoke in a firm, clear voice. Even through the audio on my phone, I could hear the shift. My father wasn't used to being cut off. His smile froze a little, but he kept trying to look in control. The officer explained they were there because of an illegal occupancy complaint. He stated it plainly. There was no confusion in his voice, no room for my father to twist the story. My father tried to laugh it off, insisting it had to be a misunderstanding. He said his full name loudly, as if that alone proved ownership. He even stepped forward like he was ready to show proof. The officer looked down at the tablet again and read the information without hesitation. He repeated that the house had been sold years ago to Aegis Holdings LLC. Hearing the date spoken out loud made my father blink fast, like he couldn't process what was happening. The officer added that my father was listed only as a tenant and that the owner had submitted video proof showing a clear violation of the agreement. The moment the officer mentioned the 24-hour notice to vacate, my father's whole face changed. The confidence drained from him so quickly it almost looked like he aged in those few seconds. He kept shaking his head, telling them they were wrong, insisting the house was his. He raised his voice, and I could see him trying to wave the officer inside to prove it. But they didn't move. Behind him, the relatives who had been laughing minutes earlier appeared in the hallway. Their faces looked stunned, as if reality had flipped on them. Jackson stepped forward, clearly ready to argue, but the second officer lifted a hand and told him to stay back. Even he went quiet. Watching all this on my phone, I didn't feel joy or revenge. I just felt this deep sense of clarity. They had treated me like nothing. They had thrown me out without a second thought. And now the truth they ignored for years was standing right in their living room, wearing a badge and holding official documents. My father kept insisting the house belonged to him, but his voice didn't sound the same. The officer repeated that they were there to deliver the notice, and that refusal to comply would lead to legal consequences. And in that moment, watching his expression shift from arrogance to shock, I realized this was the first time in his life he was facing the real weight of his own actions. The room felt heavy with tension as the police went over the situation, explaining calmly that the house belonged to Aegis Holdings LLC and that my father and brother were tenants, not owners. The statements were clear, backed with documents and video evidence, and there was no room for debate. The confident atmosphere my family had built dissolved in an instant. Faces that were moments ago smug or dismissive now showed confusion, disbelief, even fear. My mother's voice finally broke through the silence. She sounded small, almost childlike, whispering, "Roland, what is he talking about?" 2021. It was the first time she seemed to question anything my father had told her. I could hear the hesitation in her tone, the realization creeping in that their comfortable stories were lies. She had believed the narrative they'd spun for years, and now the foundation of that belief was cracking. The truth behind the house had been my secret for so long. After my father's gambling problems almost caused a foreclosure, I stepped in quietly. I purchased the property under my LLC and arranged for them to stay as tenants, paying a symbolic rent of $1 a year. I did it to protect them, not to gain control, and I had made sure the arrangement included a clause for mutual respect, expecting basic decency in return. Their behavior that night, demanding I sign a loan for a house that wasn't theirs, was the fourth clear violation of that agreement. It gave the police everything they needed to serve the immediate eviction notice. Jackson's smug confidence faltered as the implications sank in. His successful empire, that he had boasted about for years, now seemed like nothing more than a fragile illusion propped up by my money and my patience. Every lie he told, every exaggerated story, now hung in the air like evidence of his deceit. The relatives who had cheered his achievements looked uneasy, their faces shifting from amusement to discomfort. Some began quietly stepping toward the exit, avoiding eye contact with him and my father, as if the truth made them ashamed for having celebrated his successes. My father's posture, once tall and commanding, sagged as he listened to the officers repeat the facts. His words came out frantic, trying to dispute records he hadn't even seen. But the proof was solid, undeniable. The room no longer held celebration or false warmth. Every smile vanished, replaced by silence heavy with tension and embarrassment. Standing apart, I felt no rush of satisfaction. This was not about revenge in the moment. It was about setting the record straight. They had ignored my efforts, dismissed my contributions, and treated me like I didn't exist in their world. Now the truth was visible for everyone to see, exposing the lies and deceit they had built their lives upon. As the room slowly emptied, I knew the power dynamic had shifted. Their world was unraveling, and for the first time, I was completely free of their illusions. I arrived just as the officers finished their work, and the house was quiet except for low murmurs. My father stood frozen, his usual arrogance replaced with a stunned, broken expression. My brother fumbled, trying to form excuses, but the words sounded empty even to him. My mother simply looked at me, her eyes wide, as if seeing me for the first time in years. There was no greeting, no apology, just the weight of everything she had ignored finally pressing down. "You," my father finally croaked, his voice shaking. "All this time, Yes, I said, calm and steady. All this time. I stepped forward, meeting his gaze without hesitation. Every tax bill, every repair, the roof after the storm, it was me. Not Jackson. Me. My words hung in the air, undeniable and final. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything they had ever thrown at me. I handed my mother a folder. She opened it slowly, her fingers trembling as she looked inside. The deed to the house, the lease agreement, and the bank statements were all there, proving every dollar I had sent home, every effort I had made to keep them safe and comfortable. This is the truth, I told her quietly. You have 24 hours to remove your belongings from my house. For a moment, none of them spoke. My father's jaw tightened, his face pale, and Jackson looked as if he had just realized the ground beneath him had disappeared. My mother's eyes filled with a mixture of shock, guilt, and confusion, but she didn't argue. The evidence left no room for denial. I turned toward the door, not as the hurt daughter they had humiliated for years, but as someone who had reclaimed her own power. Each step felt deliberate, a reminder that I no longer needed their approval or validation. Every insult, every betrayal, every demand they had made no longer had the power to shake me. I had foreclosed not just on a property, but on their control over me. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, leaving the ground crisp and clean. The cold air felt like freedom, sharp and invigorating. For the first time in years, the future ahead was clear. I didn't need anyone else's permission to live my life, and I didn't need to carry the weight of their mistakes any longer. As I walked away from the house, I felt a quiet satisfaction, not from revenge, but from finally taking control of my own story. Everything that had held me back was behind me now, and ahead was a life I would shape entirely on my own terms. Do you think I did the right thing by taking back control and evicting my family, or should I have forgiven them? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe and hit the bell for more stories like this.